Imagine this. One of the world's most powerful armies, the Soviet Union, marching into Afghanistan, thinking they'd take control in a matter of months. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a brutal, endless war against an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't defeat. What started as a quick intervention turned into a bloody disaster, often compared to America's failure in Vietnam.
And it wasn't just a fight between the Soviets and Afghan rebels, the Mujahideen. This war was a chess game played on the grand stage of the Cold War. The United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and China poured money and weapons into the hands of the Afghan fighters, turning the mountains of Afghanistan into a deadly battlefield of global politics.
More than 1 million people died. Entire villages were wiped off the map, and over 5 million Afghans became refugees. The war left scars that Afghanistan is still struggling with today. It also played a major role in the collapse of the Soviet Union itself.
But how did it all begin? Why did the Soviets invade? Who were the Mujahideen? And what happened after the war? Let's dive into the story of the Soviet-Afghan War.
All right, so let's go back to the late 1970s. Afghanistan was already in chaos before the Soviets even arrived. The country was ruled by a communist party called the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA. They had taken power in 1978 through a violent coup, and their new government immediately started making big changes. Too big and too fast.
Yeah, and that was a huge problem. The PDPA wanted to modernize Afghanistan, but their way of doing it made people furious. They introduced land reforms that took property from big landlords and gave it to poor farmers. Sounds good in theory, right? But in reality, it was a disaster. The way they handled it was chaotic, and it upset the traditional power structure.
And that wasn't even the worst part. The government also started attacking Afghan traditions. They pushed for women's rights, which angered conservative groups. They tried to weaken the power of religious leaders, which made them enemies of the mullahs, and they used violence to crush anyone who spoke out against them. That's when the uprising started.
Exactly. By 1979, the country was on fire. Protests turned into armed rebellions, and soon, the PDPA realized they couldn't control the situation. So, what did they do? They called Moscow, again and again, asking for help. At first, the Soviet leaders weren't sure. They knew Afghanistan was unstable, but they didn't want to get stuck in a long war.
But then something happened that changed everything. The Afghan president at the time, Nur Muhammad Taraki, was assassinated by his own prime minister, Hafizullah Amin. The Soviets didn't trust Amin at all. They thought he was too violent, too unpredictable. Worse, they feared he might secretly be talking to the Americans.
That was the final straw. In December 1979, Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan. Their mission? Get rid of Amin, stabilize the country, and support the communist government. What they didn't realize was that they had just stepped into a war they could never truly win.
So the Soviets rolled into Afghanistan, thinking they could stabilize the country in a few months. But they were about to face something they hadn't expected, one of the most determined and well-supported resistance movements in modern history.
Yeah, I mean, the Soviets had tanks, helicopters, and thousands of troops, but the Afghan rebels, known as the Mujahideen, had something just as powerful. Knowledge of the land, deep religious motivation, and eventually support from countries all over the world.
Let's talk about who the Mujahideen really were. They weren't one united army. Instead, they were made up of different groups, each with its own leader and fighters. Some were fighting for Islam, others for Afghan nationalism, and some just wanted to get rid of the communists. They used guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, and hiding in the mountains where Soviet tanks couldn't reach them.
And here's where things get interesting. This wasn't just an Afghan war anymore. The United States saw a golden opportunity to hurt the Soviet Union without sending in American soldiers. Through Operation Cyclone, the CIA funneled billions of dollars in weapons and supplies to the Mujahideen. The U.S. worked closely with Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, which trained and armed the fighters.
It wasn't just the U.S. either. Saudi Arabia sent money, China provided weapons, and even the UK got involved. Meanwhile, Pakistan turned into a massive training ground for Afghan fighters. And let's not forget the foreign volunteers, fighters from Arab countries, including a young Osama bin Laden, who saw this as a holy war.
With all this support, the Mujahideen became a deadly force. They weren't just surviving against the Soviet army, they were fighting back hard. And soon, they would get a game-changing weapon that would make Soviet victories even more difficult.
With the Mujahideen growing stronger, the Soviet Union realized this war wasn't going to be as easy as they had hoped. Instead of quick victories, they found themselves stuck in a brutal conflict where they controlled the cities, but the countryside belonged to the rebels. And their response? Pure destruction.
Yeah, the Soviets decided that if they couldn't defeat the Mujahideen directly, they'd destroy everything that could help them. They bombed entire villages, burned crops, and poisoned water supplies. They even dropped millions of landmines all over the country, landmines that are still killing and injuring people today.
And it wasn't just the Soviet army doing this. The Afghan communist government, backed by Moscow, also carried out mass arrests, torture, and executions of anyone they thought was supporting the Mujahideen. Thousands of people simply disappeared, never to be seen again.
The result? One of the worst humanitarian crises in history. More than 1 million Afghans were killed, and at least 5 million became refugees. Most fled to Pakistan and Iran, living in overcrowded camps with little food or medical care. Can you imagine what it must have been like? Your home is gone, your family is scattered, and your only option is to escape to another country.
And for those who stayed behind, life was a nightmare. Bombs, hunger, and the constant fear of being caught in the crossfire. Even Soviet soldiers suffered. Many were young conscripts, sent to fight a war they didn't understand. Morale was low, desertion was high, and they faced brutal ambushes every time they left their bases.
By the mid-1980s, the Soviets were bleeding. Their resources were draining, their soldiers were dying, and the Mujahideen were only getting stronger.
By the mid-1980s, the war had turned into a disaster for the Soviet Union. They had the firepower, the helicopters, the tanks, but none of it was enough. The Mujahideen kept hitting them with hit-and-run attacks, and no matter how many villages they bombed, new fighters kept joining the resistance.
And then came the Stinger missile, a game-changer. The U.S. had been helping the Mujahideen for years, but in 1986, they sent something special: portable, shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles that could take down Soviet helicopters and planes. Suddenly, the Mujahideen weren't just hiding in the mountains, they were shooting the Soviets out of the sky.
This was huge. Soviet helicopters had been their biggest advantage, but now, flying was a death sentence. Pilots refused to take off, supply lines were cut, and the Soviets lost control of the skies. Morale among their troops plummeted.
Back in Moscow, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was under pressure. The war was draining money, Soviet soldiers were coming home in body bags, and international criticism was growing. Gorbachev wanted to fix the Soviet economy and improve relations with the West. That meant ending the war.
In 1988, the Soviets signed the Geneva Accords, agreeing to withdraw. Over the next 9 months, they packed up their weapons, loaded their tanks, and got out. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldier crossed the border back into the USSR. So, the Soviets finally left Afghanistan in 1989, but the war didn't end there. In fact, things were about to get even worse. The communist government in Kabul, left behind by the Soviets, somehow managed to hold on for 3 more years. But without Soviet support, it was only a matter of time before it collapsed.
And in 1992, it did. The Mujahideen finally took Kabul, but instead of bringing peace, they turned on each other. Different groups wanted power, and soon, Afghanistan was trapped in a brutal civil war. Cities were bombed, thousands more were killed, and warlords ruled different parts of the country like mini-kings.
This chaos created the perfect conditions for a new force to rise: the Taliban. Many of their fighters were young men who had grown up in refugee camps, raised on war and hardship. By 1996, they had taken control of Afghanistan, promising to bring order. Instead, they brought strict Islamic rule, oppression, and terror.
And let's not forget the bigger picture. This war didn't just destroy Afghanistan, it played a huge role in bringing down the Soviet Union itself. The war had drained billions from the Soviet economy, exposed their military weaknesses, and fueled anti-government protests at home. Just 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed.
And then there's another consequence, one that would come back to haunt the world. The US and its allies had heavily armed and funded the Mujahideen, but once the Soviets were gone, they walked away from Afghanistan. Some of those fighters, including a man named Osama bin Laden, would go on to form Al-Qaeda.
In other words, the Soviet-Afghan War didn't just change Afghanistan. It shaped modern history, leading to September 11th, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, and the global war on terror.
So, what started as a Soviet mission to stabilize Afghanistan turned into one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. The Soviets expected a quick victory, but instead, they got a decade of war, massive losses, and an unwinnable fight against the Mujahideen.
And the effects didn't stop when the last Soviet soldier left in 1989. Afghanistan was left in ruins, torn apart by civil war, which eventually led to the rise of the Taliban. At the same time, the Soviet Union itself collapsed, partly because of the cost of this war. And let's not forget how this conflict planted the seeds for modern terrorism.
It's crazy to think about how this war shaped the world we live in today. Without it, maybe there would have been no Taliban, no Al-Qaeda, and maybe even no 9/11. It all goes back to this one war that started in 1979.
History is full of moments like this, events that seem small at the time but change the world forever. And that's why we love talking about them. Let us know whose story you'd like to hear next. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more history.